The sound wasn't a scream. Screams are expected. Screams are human. This was a thud, thick, wet, and heavy. It was the sound of a solid oak cutting board, something meant for chopping vegetables and preparing Sunday roasts, crashing against bone. In that split second, the kitchen tool transformed. It wasn't a piece of home decor anymore. It was an instrument of absolute rage. Christy Mirack stood in her entryway, the taste of her morning coffee still fresh, her mind likely drifting toward her sixth-grade students. She was ready for the world. She was ready for the day. But the world had pushed its way inside her door before she could even step out. There was no warning. No long, drawn-out suspense. Just the sudden, violent presence of a person who had decided her life was worth less than his dark impulse. The air in the townhouse was instantly charged with a jagged, white-hot terror. Every blow from that wooden board carried the weight of a person who didn't just want to hurt her. They wanted to erase her. It was a savage, focused energy that turned a quiet Riverbend Lane morning into a slaughterhouse. You can feel the heat of that anger, even now, decades later. It's the kind of violence that leaves a permanent stain on the walls, even after the paint is scrubbed and the furniture is replaced. It was the sound of a life being violently interrupted by someone who felt entitled to every scream she couldn't let out. When the police eventually stood where she fell, they saw a detail that broke their hearts and fueled their fury. Christy had one boot on and one boot off. It's a small thing, but it's a detail that screams. It tells you exactly where she was in her life. She was halfway to the door. She was in that mundane, everyday rush to get to work. She was in the middle of a sentence her brain never got to finish. The struggle wasn't quick. It was a desperate, clawing fight for air and existence. You can see the scuffs on the floor where her heels dug in, trying to find purchase against a floor that had suddenly become a battlefield. Her coat was likely within reach, hanging on a hook, a symbol of the outside world she would never see again. The anger in this room wasn't quiet. It was a roaring physical force. This wasn't a robbery. No one was looking for jewelry or cash. The person standing over her didn't want her things. He wanted her fear. He wanted to dominate a woman who represented everything he was not: kindness, structure, and a future. Every second she fought back was a second of pure, unadulterated pain. She fought for her students, for her family, and for her very breath, while a monster used her own household items to beat the life out of her. It's a level of cruelty that makes your blood run cold, to be murdered in the very place you felt the safest, using the very objects you used to feed yourself. He was close. So close she could probably smell the winter air clinging to his jacket. So close she could see the lack of mercy in his eyes. There was no mask, no distance. This was an intimate, face-to-face violation. The intruder didn't just strike, he strangled. He used his hands to ensure the light in her eyes went out. He wanted to feel the exact moment her heart stopped. A sick, twisted power trip that defies any logic. The silence that followed the struggle was the loudest thing in the world. It was a heavy, metallic silence, thick with the scent of blood and the bitter chill of the December wind blowing through an open door. The man who did this didn't run away in a panic. He stayed. He took his time. He committed a final, degrading act of sexual assault on a woman who was already broken. Think about the sheer, cold-blooded nerve it takes to stand in a dead woman's home, hearing the clock tick on the wall, knowing you've just committed an atrocity, and still remaining calm enough to walk out and blend into the morning fog. He left her there, a teacher who was loved by hundreds, lying on her floor like a discarded object. He didn't just kill Christy Mirack. He took a sledgehammer to the sense of security of every person in that town. He left a hole in the world that would take 24 years to even begin to fill. You have to ask yourself, how well do you really know the people you see every day? Your neighbor, your mailman, the guy playing music at a party, are they who they say they are? A lot of us think we can spot a monster. We think they look different, act different, or stay in the shadows. But the reality is much more terrifying. Sometimes the devil isn't hiding. Sometimes he's the one holding the door open for you. Have you ever felt a sudden, unexplained chill when someone walks past you? Have you ever had that gut feeling that a person's smile doesn't reach their eyes? In Lancaster County, People stopped trusting those instincts. They started locking their doors, but the person they should have been afraid of was already part of their world. He was a person they liked, a person they invited to their celebrations. This is the story of a cold-blooded killer who hid in the brightest lights imaginable. This is about a man who watched a family grieve for decades while he lived a life of fame and applause. We are going to look at the science that finally trapped him and the betrayal that left a community reeling. Before we dive into this shocking and heartbreaking story, subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. December in Lancaster County used to mean something specific. It meant a world where the primary worry was whether the coming frost would turn the roads into glass, or if the local stores would run out of the most popular toys before the holiday rush. In 1994, this corner of Pennsylvania felt like a fortress of tradition and quiet routine. People moved through their lives with a sense of total immunity. You could walk down a street in the Philadelphia suburbs and see houses where the only thing separating a family from the outside world was a thin screen door or a wooden latch that hadn't been turned in years. Security wasn't a set of bolts and alarms. It was a shared agreement among neighbors that everyone belonged and everyone was safe. This was the environment that shaped the life of a young teacher. It was a place where you didn't look over your shoulder when walking to your car in the early morning fog. The community functioned on a collective belief that the kind of brutality seen on the nightly news stayed in the big cities, trapped behind the concrete and steel of far-off zip codes. But this comfort was a trap. It created a vulnerability that an opportunist could exploit with terrifying ease. In these quiet, tree-lined pockets, a stranger wasn't a threat. They were just someone you hadn't met yet. This lack of fear is what makes the events of that December morning so jagged and sharp. The town wasn't prepared for a predator because they had convinced themselves that predators didn't exist in their world. They lived in a bubble of peace that was about to be popped by a force so loud and so violent that the silence following it would never truly go away. The classrooms at Rohrerstown Elementary were vibrating with a specific kind of energy that only exists in the final days before a winter break. Tinsel was draped over chalkboards and paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling, moving slightly every time the heater kicked on. For the sixth graders in Christy Mirack's room, the morning of December 21st was supposed to be a celebration. They were children who looked at their teacher as an anchor, a person who transformed a cold school building into a place of warmth and humor. But as the clock on the wall ticked past 8 o'clock, that warmth began to evaporate. The chair behind the desk remained empty. Her lesson plans were laid out, her materials were ready, but the woman who brought them to life was missing. It was a silence that felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on the desks. Teachers like Christy are never late without a phone call. She was a woman of discipline and deep care for her students. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the festive atmosphere in the hallways began to curdle into a sharp, biting anxiety. The administration didn't see a car trouble excuse or a simple oversleeping mishap. They saw a void. The school principal looked at that empty desk and felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He knew the rhythm of his staff, and Christy never missed a beat. The chatter of the children started to quiet down as they noticed the adults whispering in the doorways, their faces pale and their eyes darting toward the windows. Something was broken in the routine of the day. The holiday joy had been replaced by a looming, dark question mark that no one wanted to voice out loud. When the investigators looked at the front door of the townhouse on Riverbend Lane, they found a detail that changed the entire nature of the crime. It was unlocked. For a single woman living alone in a ground-floor unit, this was a massive departure from her usual habits. Christy was known for being cautious and aware of her surroundings. She wasn't the type of person to leave her sanctuary vulnerable to the wind, let alone a stranger. This suggests a terrifying reality that the town didn't want to face. Either the person who ended her life was someone she trusted enough to let inside, or they were someone who moved with such speed and confidence that she never had the chance to turn the deadbolt. The lack of forced entry points to a moment of recognition. Imagine standing in your entryway, ready to head to work, and seeing a familiar face through the glass. You turn the handle, thinking it's a neighbor or a friend, and in that 1 second of kindness, you invite your own destruction inside. This unlocked door acts as a window into the killer's mind. He didn't have to break a window or kick in a frame. He walked right in. This suggests a level of entitlement and comfort that is hard to stomach. It means the killer knew where she lived, knew her schedule, and knew exactly when she would be most vulnerable, caught between the safety of her home and the start of her professional day. The intruder didn't have to hide in the bushes. He simply waited for the latch to click. That open door became a gateway for a level of cruelty that the community couldn't comprehend. It turned her private space into a public tragedy. The simple act of not locking a door became the difference between a normal Wednesday and a decades-long nightmare that would haunt every person who ever called her a friend. Gregory Sterling pulled into the parking lot of the townhouse complex with a feeling of dread that was already vibrating through his chest. The morning air was a biting, cruel cold that seemed to suck the moisture out of his lungs. He looked toward Christy's designated parking space and his heart sank. Her white Toyota was sitting there, stationary and silent. A thick layer of frost covered the windshield, undisturbed and solid. There were no marks in the ice from a scraper, no signs that she had even attempted to start her commute. It was a visual confirmation that she hadn't made it past her front door. Every step Sterling took toward her unit felt heavier than the last. The sound of his own shoes hitting the frozen pavement was the only noise in the courtyard, a rhythmic, lonely thud that signaled the end of the world as he knew it. He reached the door and noticed it wasn't quite flush with the frame. It was ajar, just enough to let the heat of the home bleed out into the winter morning. When he finally pushed that door open, the transition from the freezing outdoors to the interior was a shock to his senses. It wasn't just the warmth, it was the heavy metallic scent that filled the hallway. He called her name into the stillness, his voice sounding small and fragile against the carnage he was about to witness. The sight of her body near the entryway, surrounded by the wreckage of her final struggle, was an image that would never leave his mind. He saw the teacher, who was supposed to be reading stories to children lying in a pool of her own life, a victim of a rage so intense it felt physical. In that moment, the school principal wasn't looking at a crime scene. He was looking at the total destruction of a human life and the birth of a fear that would paralyze Lancaster County for 24 years. The transition from the freezing sidewalk to the interior of the townhouse was a violent assault on the senses. Outside, the world was crisp, clean, and silent under a layer of December frost. Inside, the atmosphere was thick and stagnant, heavy with a heat that felt like a physical weight. The first thing that hit Gregory Sterling wasn't a sight, but a smell, the undeniable sharp tang of copper that hung in the air like a fog. It was the scent of a life poured out onto the carpet, a primal odor that bypassed logic and went straight to the gut. The hallway felt narrow and suffocating, the walls seemingly closing in as the reality of the scene began to take shape. This was no longer a home. It was a chamber of horrors, where the mundane and the monstrous had collided with devastating force. The living room was a scene of total chaos that mocked the order Christy had built for herself. Furniture was shifted, decorations were tossed aside, and the stillness was so absolute it felt like it was screaming. The contrast between the festive holiday cards on the mantel and the wreckage on the floor was a sharp jab to the heart. There was a heat in the room that didn't come from the furnace, but from the residual energy of a struggle that had been both personal and prolonged. Every shadow in the corner seemed to pulse with the echo of the violence that had occurred just hours before. Sterling stood at the threshold, paralyzed by the realization that the woman who was the light of her school had been extinguished in the dark. The air was so saturated with the aftermath of the attack that every breath felt like inhaling the tragedy itself. The physical evidence left behind in that small entryway told a story of a woman who fought with every ounce of her remaining strength. As the investigation began to move through the room, the logic of the attack became horrifyingly clear. Christy was dressed for her day, ready to face her students, wearing clothes that spoke of her professionalism and her pride. The sight of one boot still on her foot and the other lying several feet away was a jarring testament to the suddenness of the assault. She hadn't been caught in her sleep. She hadn't been ambushed in the shower. She was at the very edge of her freedom, her keys likely in her hand or her pocket, when the world turned upside down. This wasn't a quick or clean encounter. The scuff marks on the walls and the displacement of heavy objects showed a desperate rolling fight for survival that spanned the length of the hall. Every detail pointed toward a predator who had no interest in stealth once the door was closed. The struggle was loud, messy, and filled with a frantic energy that must have been deafening in the early morning quiet. Yet, none of the neighbors had reported hearing a thing. It suggests the killer used his size and weight to pin her down, smothering her attempts to cry out for help. The sheer amount of physical exertion required to cause that much damage to the room showed a level of stamina and determination that was truly frightening. The victim wasn't just a target. She was an obstacle that the killer was determined to break. Looking at the wreckage, it was impossible not to feel the phantom of her fear, the realization that her own home had become a cage, and the exit she was so close to reaching had been blocked by a man who had no intention of letting her leave alive. Detective Marcus Thorne stepped through the door and immediately felt the shift in the room's energy. He was a man who had spent years walking through the aftermath of human cruelty. But this felt different. It didn't have the messy, disorganized feel of a random robbery or a drug deal gone wrong. There was a precision to the destruction that made the hair on his arms stand up. He moved with a heavy, deliberate pace, his eyes scanning the floor without disturbing the geometry of the evidence. He saw the teacher's broken form and the weapon that had been used, a heavy wooden cutting board that lay nearby like a discarded piece of trash. The sight of a domestic object used with such absolute savagery told Thorne everything he needed to know about the person they were hunting. This wasn't just a crime. It was an execution of a woman's peace. The detective looked at his partner and didn't need to say a word. The weight of the responsibility was already pressing down on his shoulders. He could see the potential for this case to become a ghost that would haunt the precinct for years. Every surface in the townhouse seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for someone to give a voice to the victim. Thorne noticed the lack of blood spatter on the door handle, suggesting the killer had been careful or had used a different exit. He knelt down, observing the way the light hit the scuff marks on the floorboards. To a seasoned investigator, these weren't just marks. They were a map of the final moments of a life. The rage required to inflict this much damage with a blunt object spoke of a deep, dark reservoir of anger within the attacker. Thorne knew right then that they weren't looking for a man who had simply lost his temper. They were looking for a monster who could switch his humanity off at will. The most chilling aspect of the scene was what remained intact. Detective Thorne moved to the front door, his fingers hovering just inches from the lock. There were no scratches around the keyhole, no splintered wood near the frame, and the deadbolt operated with a smooth, effortless click. The windows were all secured from the inside, their glass unbroken, mocking the idea of an outside intruder forcing their way into this sanctuary. This lack of forced entry stripped away the comfort of a random break-in. It meant that Christy had either opened her door to a face she knew, or she had been followed so closely that the killer stepped over the threshold before the latch could even engage. The realization hung in the air like a second layer of heat. This was a targeted strike, a predatory move by someone who knew her movements and her vulnerabilities. The investigation shifted its focus to the circle of people who had access to her life. To walk into a woman's home and use her own kitchen tools to end her existence requires a level of familiarity that is nauseating. It implies a person who had been in that kitchen before, someone who knew exactly where the heavy objects were kept. The killer didn't bring a gun or a knife. He used the environment against her. This choice of a domestic weapon suggests a crime of sudden, explosive opportunity or a deep-seated resentment that found its outlet in the most personal way possible. As the sun began to set on that first day, the team realized the person they were looking for wasn't a shadow in the woods. He was likely a name in her phone book, a person she had smiled at, or someone she had trusted with her safety. The predator wasn't a stranger. He was a guest who had turned into a ghost. In 1994, the tools available to law enforcement felt like they were from a different century compared to what we know today. While the detectives in Lancaster County were dedicated and tireless, they were working within the rigid boundaries of a scientific era that was only just beginning to understand the power of the human code. At that time, DNA was a revolutionary concept, a whisper of a promise that had not yet been fully realized in the courtroom or the crime lab. Investigators knew they had something valuable, a biological footprint left behind by the man who had destroyed Christy's life, but they were essentially holding a high-tech map in a world that hadn't yet invented the compass. The process of analyzing these samples was slow, expensive, and often inconclusive. There was no massive interconnected computer network where you could simply press a button and wait for a name to pop up on a screen. The lab technicians worked with a sense of clinical detachment, moving through the motions of extracting what they could from the evidence collected at Riverbend Lane. But every time they reached a conclusion, they hit a wall. The technology could tell them that the samples belonged to a male, and it could provide a specific profile, but without a person to compare it against, that profile was just a series of numbers and markers on a page. It was a frustrating, quiet struggle against the clock. Every day that passed without a match was another day the trail grew colder. The police were forced to rely on traditional methods, knocking on doors, checking alibis, and following up on tips that usually led to nowhere. They were fighting a modern war with vintage weapons, and the killer was the one reaping the benefits of that gap in history. The biological evidence recovered from the townhouse was a perfect, pristine signature, but it was a signature written in a language no one could yet read. To the investigators, that DNA profile was a key without a lock. It sat in a sterile vial, a microscopic record of the killer's identity, holding every detail of his physical being within its strands. It was an absolute truth, a silent witness that didn't forget and couldn't lie. But in the mid-90s, the national databases were essentially empty. Unless the attacker had already been convicted of a violent crime and had his profile entered into the infant system, the police were just staring at a ghost. They had the man's very essence in their hands, yet he remained as anonymous as a shadow in a crowd. It was a unique form of torture for the detectives. They knew they were holding the answer to the mystery, but the world wasn't ready to let them see the face attached to it. This evidence became a dormant force, tucked away in an evidence locker while the seasons changed outside. It was a digital fingerprint with no surface to stick to. The lab results confirmed that the violence was the work of a single individual, a man who had left a part of himself behind in his frantic, high-energy assault. But as the weeks turned into months, that biological profile began to feel more like a burden than a breakthrough. It was a constant reminder of what they lacked. Every time a new suspect was brought in, the hope would surge, only to be crushed by a lab report that said the markers didn't align. The science was there, but the infrastructure was a desert. The killer was walking the streets, breathing the same winter air as the people of Lancaster, completely unaware that he had left a ticking time bomb of data behind a bomb that was waiting for a future generation to find the detonator. The search for the person who had silenced Christy Mirack began with a frantic, wide-reaching sweep of every man who had ever crossed her path. Detectives started with the inner circle, looking at former boyfriends, colleagues, and acquaintances who might have harbored a hidden resentment or a sudden explosive fixation. They looked for the telltale signs of a struggle, fresh scratches on a face, bruised knuckles, or an uncharacteristic absence from work on that December morning. It was an exhaustive manual process of elimination. Investigators spent their nights in wood-paneled interrogation rooms, watching the body language of men who claimed to be devastated by the news. They collected blood samples and hair follicles, hoping that the next vial would be the one that finally clicked into place with the evidence from the townhouse. The pressure from the public was a constant, thrumming weight. The news of a beautiful young teacher murdered in her own home had turned the town into a pressure cooker of demands for justice. Every tip that came into the precinct was treated as a potential breakthrough, leading officers to follow up on sightings of strange cars and men acting nervous at local gas stations. They looked into the backgrounds of delivery drivers and maintenance workers who had been in the vicinity of Riverbend Lane. But with every interview that ended in a solid alibi, the perimeter of the search had to be pushed further out. The exhaustion among the force was visible. They were chasing a phantom who seemed to have dissolved into the Philadelphia mist. The initial hunt was a mountain of paperwork and dead ends, a series of high-stakes leads that evaporated as soon as they were put under the microscope of a background check. As the investigation stalled, a heavy, suffocating atmosphere settled over the entire county. It was a sinking feeling that took root in the pit of the stomach, a realization that the person responsible for such a horrific act wasn't a monster from a movie, but a man who was likely standing in the same grocery store lines as everyone else. Have you ever felt that sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline when you realize a person's smile doesn't match the coldness in their eyes? That was the reality for the women of Lancaster. They began to look at their neighbors, their friends, and even the people they saw every day at the coffee shop with a new, jagged sense of suspicion. The collective safety of the community had been shattered, and in its place was the terrifying knowledge that a predator was hiding in plain sight, perfectly camouflaged by the mundane details of suburban life. The biological signature sat in the evidence locker, a silent witness to a truth that no one could reach. It was a piece of the killer, a fragment of his very being, yet it offered no protection to the public. Every man in the town became a potential threat in the eyes of his peers. The fear wasn't just about the crime itself, it was about the anonymity of the perpetrator. He had walked out of that blood-soaked townhouse and stepped back into a normal life, as if he had simply finished a shift at work. He was breathing the same air, watching the same news reports, and perhaps even offering words of comfort to those who were grieving. This psychological weight turned the town into a place of locked doors and avoided eye contact. The evidence was a promise of a future answer, but for now, it was just a reminder of a failure. The monster was still out there, and he was closer than anyone dared to imagine. The suspicion in Lancaster County soon found a physical form in a man named Calvin Gable. He was a local handyman, the kind of person who existed on the edges of the neighborhood's social life, always present but never truly part of it. Gable had been working on a unit just a few doors down from Christy's townhouse during the week of the attack. He was a man with a reputation for a short fuse, and a simmering, unpredictable energy that made people keep their distance. When the detectives looked at his history, they found a record of a man who didn't handle frustration well. To a community desperate for an answer, he was the perfect antagonist. He had the access, he had the physical strength, and he had the kind of background that made it easy for people to believe he was capable of an explosion of violence. The investigation turned its full weight toward him, watching his every move. The neighbors began to report every strange glance or muttered word, feeding a narrative that Gable was the monster they had been fearing. There was a logic to the focus on him. A man working with tools, accustomed to the layout of these identical townhouses, would have known exactly how to move through the complex without drawing attention. He was a person who dealt in the physical world of wood and metal, someone who could easily have seen Christy as she walked to her car each morning. The police saw a man who didn't fit into the polite, quiet suburbs, and they began to squeeze. Every day he remained free felt like a failure to the people of Lancaster, who wanted to believe that the darkness among them had a recognizable face they could lock away and forget. The interrogation room felt like a concrete box designed to drain the hope out of anyone sitting at the metal table. Calvin Gable sat under the harsh, humming lights, his hands trembling as he tried to light a cigarette. The air was thick with the scent of cheap coffee and the stagnant smell of old sweat. Across from him, the detectives moved in close, their voices a rhythmic driving force intended to break his composure. They didn't just ask questions. They painted a picture of his own guilt, leaning on his history of anger and his proximity to the scene. They wanted a crack in the foundation of his story. They wanted to hear him admit that he had seen her, that he had wanted her, and that he had let his rage take over. Gable's eyes darted toward the corners of the room as if looking for an exit that didn't exist. Every time he denied being there, the pressure increased. The officers pointed out the lack of a solid alibi for the exact window of time when the life was being beaten out of Christy Mirack. They told him they had his DNA, that they had his fingerprints, and that it was only a matter of time before the science caught up to his lies. It was a psychological game of cat and mouse, played in a room where the clock seemed to have stopped. Gable's voice grew hoarse as he insisted he was a drunk and a grouch, but not a killer. The tension was a physical presence, a weight that made it hard to breathe. The detectives watched the sweat bead on his forehead, looking for the telltale sign of a confession that would end the nightmare for the town. But despite the hours of grinding questions and the heavy atmosphere of accusation, the handyman didn't break. While the handyman was under the microscope, another name began to surface in the police files: Grant Holloway. He was the opposite of Gable, charismatic, well-dressed, and part of the local social fabric. But Holloway had a different kind of red flag in his past. He had once pursued Christy, asking her out for coffee in a way that felt persistent and perhaps a bit too intense. When she had declined, he hadn't taken it with the grace one would expect. In the mind of a criminal investigator, a bruised ego can be just as dangerous as a volatile temper. Rejection is a powerful motive for a man who feels entitled to a woman's attention. The detectives began to look at Holloway not as a charming neighbor, but as a man whose pride might have turned into a deadly fixation. They searched his trash, interviewed his former associates, and tried to map his movements on the morning of December 21st. The focus on Holloway represented a deeper fear in the community. The idea that the threat wasn't a rough-around-the-edges stranger, but a man they actually liked. If a person who could charm a room was also capable of using a cutting board as a weapon, then no one was truly safe. Holloway was followed and observed, his life turned inside out by a department that couldn't afford to let a single lead slip away. He maintained a mask of cooperation, but the police could sense the underlying tension. They were looking for a sign of obsession, a hidden photo, a diary entry, or a witness who saw him near Riverbend Lane at dawn. The investigation was moving through two very different versions of a suspect, one representing the rage of the outcast and the other the entitlement of the accepted. Both paths led back to the same blood-stained hallway, and both required the cold, hard verdict of a laboratory to prove. The atmosphere in Lancaster had reached a breaking point, a fever pitch of expectation that made every headline feel like a physical jolt. The local news was filled with images of Christy's smiling face, a constant reminder of the debt the town owed to her family. Inside the precinct, the wait for the final laboratory results was a grueling test of nerves. The DNA samples from Calvin Gable and Grant Holloway had been sent away to be compared against the biological signature left at the crime scene. Everyone from the beat cops to the district attorney believed that one of these men was the answer. They expected the science to confirm what their instincts were telling them, that the predator was finally in their grasp. The police had built their cases, the public had made up their minds, and the names of the suspects were being whispered in every hallway and coffee shop as if the arrest was already a certainty. When the lab report finally arrived, it didn't come with a celebration. It came with a silence that was more devastating than a scream. The biological code from the handyman didn't match. The markers from the charismatic suitor didn't match. Both men, despite their flaws and their suspicious behavior, were not the person who had stood over Christy Mirack on that winter morning. The doors that the investigators had been trying to kick down for months had just been slammed shut and locked from the other side. The pressure cooker of the investigation had exploded, leaving nothing but more questions and a growing sense of dread. The DNA results for the main suspect were coming back, but what the lab found shocked everyone. Comment guilty if you think the neighbor did it. If not, tell me who you think was hiding in the shadows while the police were looking at the wrong men. The death of innocence in Lancaster County didn't happen with a shout. It happened with the rhythmic, metallic click of thousands of deadbolts turning in unison. Before that December morning, the suburbs of Pennsylvania felt like a fortress of safety. A place where the biggest worry was the winter weather or the morning commute. People left their garage doors cracked for the cat and their front doors unlocked while they ran to the store. But when the news of what happened to Christy Mirack began to sink in, that communal trust evaporated overnight. The town transformed into a landscape of barriers. Hardware stores couldn't keep heavy-duty locks or security lights in stock. Every creak of a floorboard or rattle of a window pane in the middle of the night became a source of heart-stopping terror for women living alone. This was the end of an era where you knew your neighbor's schedule and didn't think twice about a car idling at the curb. The open-door policy of suburban life had been replaced by a cold, jagged caution. The very air in the grocery store aisles felt different, heavier, quieter, and thick with an unspoken anxiety. Parents who once let their children play in the cul-de-sac until the streetlights came on now kept them within arm's reach. The tragedy at Riverbend Lane had revealed a terrifying truth. The walls of a home were not as thick as everyone believed, and the sanctity of a private life could be pierced in a matter of seconds. This wasn't just fear of a specific man. It was a fear of the vulnerability that everyone had ignored for so long. The community was mourning more than a beloved teacher. They were mourning the feeling that they were safe in their own beds. The suspicion that followed the failed DNA matches was a corrosive force that began to eat away at the social fabric of the town. It created a world of sideways glances and whispered conversations behind closed doors. Men began to look at their coworkers, their gym partners, and their bowling league friends with a new, dark curiosity. They wondered if the man sitting across from them at the diner laughing over a cup of coffee, was the same person who had used a wooden board to end a young woman's life. Every man who fit the general description of a white male in his 20s or 30s was living under a cloud of unspoken accusation. If the police couldn't find the killer among the usual suspects, then he had to be someone unusual, someone who wore a mask of normalcy so perfect that it was indistinguishable from the truth. This psychological toll turned every interaction into a potential interrogation. A man who was a little too quiet, or perhaps a little too helpful, was suddenly viewed through a distorted lens. The suspicion wasn't based on evidence. It was based on the terrifying reality that the killer had no face and no name. Friendships that had lasted for years were strained as people searched for any sign of a hidden temper or a secret darkness in those they thought they knew. It was a time of internal exile for many, as the warmth of the community was replaced by a sterile, guarded politeness. You didn't invite people over for dinner as easily as you used to. You didn't offer a jump start to a stranger's car in the parking lot. The predator had succeeded in turning the town against itself, creating an environment where everyone was a stranger and no one was beyond reproach. For the Mirack family, the paranoia of the suburbs was a secondary pain to the absolute crushing weight of their grief. While the town was busy locking its doors, Christy's parents and her brother Vince were living in a world that had stopped turning. Every time the phone rang, there was a jagged spike of hope that was almost immediately followed by the hollow ache of another dead end. They had to endure the public nature of her death, seeing her high school graduation photos and her classroom portraits plastered across the nightly news. It was as if her most private tragedy had become public property, analyzed and picked apart by strangers who never knew the sound of her laugh or the way she cared for her students. The frustration of the no-match DNA results was a recurring trauma that made the healing process impossible. The family was trapped in a state of perpetual mourning, unable to move forward because the person who had stolen her future was still out there, possibly watching the same news segments they were. They had to watch as other families celebrated holidays and milestones, while their own dinner table had a permanent, agonizing vacancy. The psychological toll was an exhausting marathon of what-ifs and if-onlys. They questioned every choice she had made, every person she had known, and every moment of that final morning. The lack of an arrest meant there was no closure, no villain to face in a courtroom, and no ending to the story. They were forced to become experts in a forensic language they never wanted to learn, living in a house full of memories that felt like they were under a magnifying glass. Their sorrow wasn't just a private emotion. It was a heavy, public burden they carried through a town that was slowly moving on. The most enduring scar on Lancaster was the fear of the unknown, the realization that the killer was a ghost capable of perfect camouflage. This wasn't a monster who lived in a cave or a drifter who moved from city to city. This was someone who could commit an act of unimaginable cruelty and then go home to a family, a job, or a church service. The horror lay in his ability to blend in. He was a person who understood the rhythm of the suburbs well enough to move through them unnoticed, leaving no trail but a biological signature that the world wasn't ready to decode. This phantom threat changed the way people looked at the very concept of safety. It suggested that evil didn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looked like the man who delivered your mail or the guy who lived 2 doors down and always mowed his lawn on Saturdays. Tapping into this fear of the unknown is what kept the case alive in the collective memory of the county. It was a mystery that felt personal to everyone who lived there. The idea that a predator could be hiding in plain sight, perhaps even participating in the search for himself, was a thought too dark for most to vocalize. Yet, it was the thought that kept the lights on in the hallways at night. The community was waiting for a ghost to manifest, for a mistake to be made, or for the passing of time to finally crack the facade of the man in the shadows. But as the years began to pile up, the fear shifted from an acute panic to a dull, chronic ache. The killer had become a part of the local lore, a boogeyman who proved that even in the most quiet and professional of neighborhoods, the unthinkable was only one unlocked door away. The years began to stack like fallen leaves, burying the urgency of the investigation under the weight of time. Outside the walls of the precinct, the world was moving forward at a dizzying pace. The analog decade of the 90s dissolved into a new millennium of digital connectivity and cellular signals. The children who had been in Christy's 6th grade class grew into adults, started their own families, and moved far away from the quiet hallways of Roarstown Elementary. In the complex on Riverbend Lane, new tenants moved in and out, unaware that the floorboards beneath their feet once held the secrets of a local nightmare. The frost that had covered the white Toyota on that fateful morning melted and returned 24 times, each winter bringing a fresh layer of silence to a case that refused to be solved. The physical evidence in the locker began to age, the plastic bags yellowing slightly, and the ink on the handwritten labels starting to fade. What was once a high-priority command center filled with ringing phones and frantic maps was now just a collection of boxes. The news cycles moved on to other tragedies, other faces, and other names, leaving Christy's story to drift into the realm of local legend. It became the story people told to warn their daughters about locking the door, a cautionary tale that lost its sharp edges as the decades passed. The investigation hadn't died, but it had entered a state of hibernation, a long and bitter winter where the only thing moving was the dust settling on the files. The town had learned to live with the ghost in its midst, accepting the hole in its heart as a permanent part of the landscape, while the truth waited for a generation that hadn't even been born yet. Detective Marcus Thorne had spent a quarter of a century carrying the weight of that unfinished business. Every morning when he walked into the station, the file on Christy Mirack was a silent reprimand, a reminder of the one person he couldn't bring home. He had seen technology advance from fax machines to the internet, and he had seen the DNA database grow from a desert to an ocean, yet the name they needed never surfaced. When the day finally came for him to clear his desk, the movement of that heavy folder felt like a betrayal. He wasn't just retiring. He was handing off a burden that had defined his career. He watched as the file was boxed up, labeled with a cold case number, and carried down to the basement archives where the air was cool and the lights were dim. The transition from an active desk to the basement was a symbolic death for the investigation. In the basement, the files aren't breathed on every day. They are stored in the dark, surrounded by the forgotten mistakes and unsolved mysteries of a city's past. Thorne walked out of the building with the heavy knowledge that he was leaving a predator behind in the community he had sworn to protect. He had promised a family an answer, and instead he was giving them a cardboard box in a storage room. The basement became a graveyard of intentions, where the copper tang of the crime scene was replaced by the dry smell of old paper and stagnant air. It was a 24-year winter for the justice system, a period where the machinery of the law had ground to a halt, waiting for a spark of scientific luck that seemed more like a fantasy than a possibility. While the investigators aged and the files gathered dust, the killer was busy living a life he never deserved. He had stepped out of the blood and chaos of that townhouse and into a world that asked no questions. Over the next 24 years, he likely enjoyed the simple, beautiful things that Christy was denied: the warmth of a summer afternoon, the pride of a career, and the comfort of a family dinner. He was a master of the unremarkable, a man who could blend into a crowd so perfectly that he became invisible. He might have been the man who held the door open for you at the library, or the neighbor who waved from across the street. He carried the memory of his cruelty inside him like a hidden infection, yet he never let it show in the lines of his face or the tone of his voice. He watched the news reports on the anniversaries of the murder, seeing Christy's face and the aging faces of her family, perhaps feeling a dark sense of triumph that he had outrun the law. He saw the forensic breakthroughs being discussed on television, and likely felt a smug confidence that he had been careful enough to escape the reach of the new science. Every year he remained free was a theft, a stolen decade of peace for the Mirack family, and a stolen sense of security for the town. He was a predator who had successfully integrated back into the herd, reaping the benefits of a society he had violently attacked. He lived in the sunlight, walking the same streets and breathing the same air as the people who mourned his victim, a living testament to the idea that sometimes the most dangerous people among us are the ones who look the most normal. The long freeze of the investigation wasn't just a failure of technology. It was a ticking clock on the safety of every person in the region. For over 2 decades, a man capable of extreme, targeted violence was a ghost in the machine, a silent threat that remained active simply because the right questions hadn't been asked of the right data. It makes you wonder how many other shadows are currently walking the streets of your own neighborhood. hiding behind a mask of professional success or domestic stability. If this happened in your town tomorrow, wouldn't you want to know first? Subscribe now. The gap between a cold case and a conviction is often just a matter of time and the relentless pursuit of the truth, even when the trail seems to have vanished under 24 years of snow. The story of the 24-year winter is a reminder that justice is not always swift, and silence is often the killer's greatest ally. As the folders sat in the basement, the world was unknowingly preparing a new set of tools that would eventually melt the ice. The killer thought he had won the war against time, but he failed to realize that the biological signature he left behind was a permanent record that didn't age as he did. The DNA was a bridge across the decades, a thread of reality that connected the carnage of 1994 to the laboratory of the future. The winter was long, and the darkness was deep, but the light was beginning to change. The technology was finally catching up to the monster, and the basement was about to give up its most haunted secret. The era of anonymity was coming to an end, and the predator's unearned life was about to be dismantled. The transition from a frozen investigation to a digital manhunt began when the file was pulled from the darkness of the basement and placed onto the desk of a new generation. Detective Lauren Mitchell represented a shift in the way the law approached the impossible. She didn't look at the yellowed pages and the faded ink as a dead end. She saw them as a challenge that the previous era simply wasn't equipped to meet. While the veteran detectives had relied on physical shoe leather and limited databases, Mitchell was a creature of the information age. She understood that the killer hadn't just left behind a sample of his physical self. He had left behind a biological code that was now compatible with a global network of data. She didn't need a suspect to walk into an interrogation room. She needed a way to bridge the gap between the evidence in the locker and the digital footprints of the modern world. Mitchell wasn't intimidated by the 24 years of silence. She realized that while the predator had been hiding, the world around him had been building a trap he couldn't see. The emergence of genetic genealogy offered a new frontier, a way to use the very things people were doing for fun, researching their ancestors and exploring their heritage to solve the most brutal of crimes. She took the pristine sample that had been preserved for decades and handed it over to the specialists who could turn that saliva and skin into a digital map. This was the beginning of the digital exorcism, a process of dragging a ghost out of the archives and into the harsh light of the 21st century. The determination in the precinct had shifted from a desperate search for a witness to a clinical, scientific pursuit of a specific genetic coordinate. The breakthrough didn't come from a secret police file or a tip from an informant. It came from the innocent curiosity of distant relatives. In the years that Christy's case sat in the basement, millions of people had begun uploading their own DNA to public databases, searching for cousins or tracing their lineage back to the old world. Every time a person spat into a tube and sent it to a lab, they were unknowingly contributing to a global web of connections. When the specialists took the killer's DNA and uploaded it into these same systems, they weren't looking for a direct match. They were looking for the threads of a family tapestry. They found third and fourth cousins, people who shared a small percentage of their genetic code with the man who had stood in that Lancaster townhouse in 1994. These distant relatives were the accidental whistleblowers who would eventually lead the law to his door. This was forensics in a new dimension. By analyzing the segments of shared DNA between these strangers and the unknown subject, investigators could start to build a reverse family tree. It was a technical and dramatic process of working backward through history, identifying common ancestors from the 1800s, and then following the branches forward through time. The lab technicians and genealogists were like digital archaeologists, sifting through census records, marriage licenses, and birth certificates to populate the branches of a massive, sprawling tree. The killer's anonymity was being dismantled one cousin at a time. He had thought his secret was safe because he had never been caught, but he hadn't accounted for the fact that his own bloodline was a map that could be read by anyone with the right software and the patience to follow the trail. The process of narrowing down the search was a masterclass in deductive logic, and as the branches of the family tree began to fill in, the search area became smaller and more focused. Imagine a massive, sprawling oak tree representing hundreds of years of human history, with thousands of leaves representing living descendants. The genealogists began to prune those branches with clinical precision. They eliminated the women, the people who were the wrong age, and the individuals who were nowhere near Pennsylvania in the early 90s. With every exclusion, the family tree began to narrow like a noose, tightening around a specific limb of the lineage. The investigators were no longer looking at thousands of possibilities. They were looking at a handful of brothers and cousins within one specific family cluster. It was a visual representation of a closing circle, a relentless movement toward a single, inevitable point. The noose was tightening around a branch that had remained in the Lancaster area. The data was whispering a name that had never once appeared in the thousands of pages of the original case file. This person hadn't been a neighbor, a handyman, or a rejected suitor. He was someone who had successfully avoided every radar for nearly a quarter of a century. The digital exorcism was working. The ghost was gaining a shape, a history, and a current address. The tension in the investigation room was electric as the final links were forged. They weren't just looking for a man anymore. They were looking at a specific genetic intersection where the killer's ancestors met the geography of the crime. The sprawling tree of the past had been whittled down to a single sharp point of the present, and the man at the end of that branch was about to find out that his time had finally run out. The final profile that emerged from the genetic data pointed directly to a man named Raymond Rowe. For the detectives, the name was a complete shock. He wasn't a criminal on their watch list. He was a well-known local figure, a man who made his living in the public eye as a popular DJ and entertainer. While the police had been searching for a monster hiding in the shadows, Rowe had been performing at weddings, parties, and school events, often just miles away from where he had committed his atrocity. He was a man who specialized in creating joy and celebration, a professional chameleon who had spent 24 years wearing a mask of charisma and rhythm. The transition from a biological sequence on a computer screen to a living, breathing man with a public persona was a jarring moment of clarity for the entire team. The digital map had led them to a person who had perfectly integrated into the community. Rowe was a man who lived a life of loud music and bright lights, a stark contrast to the silent, dark basement where the evidence of his crime had waited. The investigators realized that the monster they were hunting had been hiding in plain sight, not as a recluse, but as the life of the party. The genetic genealogy had provided the coordinate, but now the detectives had to move from the digital world back into the physical one. They had to watch him, follow him, and wait for a moment where they could grab a fresh sample of his DNA to confirm what the family tree had already told them. The hunt was no longer about ghosts and shadows. It was about a man with a microphone and a secret that was about to scream louder than any speaker in his arsenal. In the tight-knit community of Lancaster, the name DJ Freeze was synonymous with a good time. Raymond Rowe had built a career out of being the heartbeat of every major celebration, a local celebrity whose energy could light up a stadium. For over 2 decades, he was the man behind the turntables, a professional who knew exactly how to read a room and keep the crowd on their feet. He wasn't just a face in the background. He was a fixture of the social scene, a charismatic figure who had performed for thousands of people across the region. He had been invited into the most intimate moments of people's lives, their weddings, their anniversaries, and their graduations, all while maintaining a reputation as a friendly, reliable, and talented entertainer. His business was thriving, his social media was filled with smiling photos, and he seemed to be the very picture of suburban success. The contrast between the man on the stage and the man in that blood-soaked hallway was a psychological chasm that was almost impossible to bridge. How could a person spend his Friday nights creating joy and his Saturday mornings blending into the mundane life of a family man, while carrying the memory of such absolute savagery? Rowe had mastered a duality that was nothing short of predatory genius. He didn't hide in a basement, he hid in the spotlight. He used the noise and the flashing lights of his profession to drown out the echoes of the screams he had caused in 1994. It was a chilling performance that lasted for 24 years, a mask of rhythm and charisma that never once slipped. He was a chameleon who understood that the best way to avoid suspicion was to become the most visible person in the room, betting on the idea that no one would ever look for a monster behind a microphone. The final trap was set not in a dark alley, but in the middle of a school event where Rowe was working his magic. Detectives from the cold case unit had to operate with surgical precision, moving through a crowd of teenagers and teachers to get close to their target. They watched him from the shadows of the gymnasium, observing the way he laughed and interacted with the crowd, his movements fluid and confident. It was a high-stakes undercover operation. They needed a fresh sample of his biological signature to confirm the genetic genealogy match. The tension was thick as they waited for him to discard something: a water bottle, a piece of gum, anything that carried the secret of his identity. They were feet away from a man who had evaded justice for a quarter of a century, watching him play upbeat hits while they held the weight of Christy's final moments in their minds. When he finally discarded a water bottle and a piece of gum, the investigators moved in like shadows, securing the items before they could be lost to the trash. The physical evidence was rushed to the lab, where the clock finally ran out for DJ Freeze. The results were a perfect match. The DNA on the bottle was an identical twin to the DNA found at the crime scene in 1994. The science had pierced the mask, revealing that the local celebrity was the phantom they had been hunting for 2.5 decades. The arrest that followed was a shockwave that leveled the community's sense of reality. The man who had been the life of the party was now the face of a cold-blooded murder, and the town had to grapple with the fact that they had been cheering for a predator for over 20 years. The revelation of Roe's identity forced the people of Lancaster to look back at their own history through a distorted and horrifying lens. They began to count the times they had stood just feet away from him, the times they had shaken his hand, or the times they had hired him to provide the soundtrack for their children's most precious memories. Most people don't know this, but the man who killed Christy was the same man playing music at your daughter's prom. He was there, smiling and nodding to the beat, while the family of the woman he destroyed was living through a perpetual winter. He had seen the community's children grow up, all while knowing that he had permanently ended the life of a teacher who should have been there to see them graduate. This was the ultimate betrayal of public trust. Roe had used his local fame as a shield, a way to ensure that he remained above suspicion. The psychological horror of his presence at school functions and community events was a new kind of trauma for the town. It proved that the predator hadn't just escaped, he had thrived. He had built a legacy of entertainment on a foundation of hidden violence. As the news of his arrest spread, the music finally stopped, leaving behind a silence that was filled with the collective realization of how close they had all been to the darkness. The mask of DJ Freeze had fallen, and in its place was a man who had stolen a life, and then spent 24 years pretending that he deserved to have one of his own. The scene inside the high school gymnasium was a jarring collision of two worlds. Under the bright buzzing lights, a sea of students celebrated a school function, their voices lost in the thumping bass of the music being played from the stage. At the center of it all was Raymond Roe, the man known as DJ Freeze, moving with the practiced ease of a local legend. But in the shadows and along the periphery of the room, a team of invisible watchers stood in silent contrast to the noise. These were plainclothes detectives, men and women who had spent decades waiting for a moment like this. They didn't see a popular entertainer. They saw a ghost that had finally been pinned to a specific location. The psychological pressure on the surveillance team was immense. They had to remain perfectly still and unremarkable, ensuring that not a single glance or gesture tipped off a man who had successfully evaded the law for 24 years. Every movement Roe made was tracked with predatory focus. The detectives watched him adjust his headphones, lean into the microphone, and touch his equipment, knowing that every surface he came into contact with was a potential goldmine of evidence. Despite the festive atmosphere, the air around the officers felt cold and heavy with the gravity of their mission. They were surrounded by hundreds of innocent people, yet their entire universe had shrunk down to the space occupied by the man behind the turntables. The loud music served as a strange, rhythmic background to the most high-stakes stakeout of their careers. They weren't just watching a suspect. They were witnessing the final performance of a mask that had been worn for a quarter of a century. The contrast between the joy on the dance floor and the grim determination of the law was a silent, invisible war being fought in the middle of a celebration. Among the team was an officer tasked with a role that required the ultimate level of patience and theater. Dressed in the nondescript uniform of a janitorial worker, the detective moved through the gymnasium with a rolling trash bin, blending perfectly into the background of the event. To the students and the school staff, he was just another face performing a thankless task, someone not worth a second glance. To the surveillance team, he was the primary interceptor. He spent hours cleaning up discarded cups and wrappers, slowly working his way closer to the stage where Roe was performing. He had to be a master of the mundane, emptying bins and sweeping floors while his heart hammered against his ribs. He watched Roe's hands with the intensity of a hawk, waiting for the one specific action that would provide the key to the case. The undercover officer moved with a calculated lack of urgency, ensuring that his presence felt like a natural part of the environment. He saw Roe take a sip from a plastic water bottle, then set it down near his mixing board. Every time the DJ reached for it, the detective's focus sharpened. The stakeout was a grueling test of nerves, a game of waiting for a man to finish a drink. The detective knew that if he moved too soon, he risked spooking a killer who had already proven he could disappear. He had to wait for the exact moment when the item became trash, when the law could legally claim it as abandoned property. The theater of acting invisible while hunting one of the county's most notorious phantoms was an exhausting mental tightrope, where one wrong move could destroy 24 years of painstaking work. The breakthrough happened with a casual, almost thoughtless gesture. As the event began to wind down and the energy in the gymnasium shifted toward the exit, Raymond Roe reached for a napkin to wipe his face, and then picked up his half-empty water bottle. With the same indifference he had shown for decades, he tossed both items into a nearby trash receptacle. To the crowd, it was a meaningless act of cleanup, but to the undercover officer, it was the literal gold of the investigation. He didn't rush, he waited for the right beat, then moved in to service the bin. With steady hands and a face that revealed nothing, he recovered the items, placing them into a clean evidence bag hidden within his cart. The adrenaline was a silent roar in his ears as he realized he was now holding the physical key to Christy Mirack's justice. The recovery of the bottle and the napkin was the culmination of a pursuit that had spanned generations of detectives. These weren't just pieces of garbage. They were biological repositories of the man who had thought he was untouchable. The team didn't celebrate on the spot. They maintained their cover until the items were safely secured in a vehicle and headed toward the state crime lab. The gold in the trash was the final piece of the puzzle, a fresh sample that would either confirm the genealogy lead or prove that the ghost was still at large. As the gymnasium lights were turned off and the music finally died away, the detectives knew that the silence of the room was finally matched by the certainty of their evidence. The man who had used the noise of the world to hide his secret had just handed over his own identity in a discarded bottle. The transition from the field back to the sterile environment of the precinct marked the beginning of a grueling, final 24-hour wait. The items were rushed into the hands of lab technicians who understood that the entire history of a cold case was riding on the results of this one test. Back at the station, the detectives sat in the quiet of their offices, unable to sleep or focus on anything else. The tension was a physical weight, an agony of anticipation that made every minute feel like an hour. They had the lead, they had the surveillance, and they had the recovered DNA, but without the final match, it was all just theory. They were standing on the precipice of a resolution that had eluded the department since 1994, and the silence of the waiting room was louder than the music in the gymnasium had ever been. This was the final stretch of a marathon that had lasted nearly a quarter of a century. The team replayed every moment of the stakeout, questioning if they had been seen or if the sample could have been contaminated. The mounting pressure was not just about making an arrest. It was about the promise made to a family that had been broken for decades. As the sun began to rise on the final day of the 24-hour window, the phone finally rang. The lab results were back. The DNA from the water bottle was an identical match to the profile from the 1994 crime scene. The 24-year search was over. The phantom had a name, a face, and a location. The agony of the wait was replaced by the cold, sharp focus of the final move. The time for watching was over. The time for the handcuffs had arrived. On the morning of the 25th of June 2018, the long winter of the Christy Mirack case finally came to a sudden, clinical end. There were no flashing lights or dramatic high-speed chases. Instead, the law arrived with the quiet, heavy inevitability of a storm that had been brewing for 24 years. When the officers moved in to arrest Raymond Rowe at his home, the man who had spent decades as the loud, energetic center of every party was suddenly silenced. As the steel handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the sound echoed back to a cold December morning in 1994. For the detectives, it was the culmination of thousands of hours of work, a moment where the digital ghost they had been hunting finally became a man of flesh and bone. Rowe, who had lived an unearned life of freedom, was led away in silence, his career as an entertainer over, and his life as a fugitive finally reaching its expiration date. The arrest sent a shockwave through Lancaster County that leveled the community's sense of reality. The news didn't just break, it exploded, shattering the carefully constructed pillar of a local celebrity. People struggled to reconcile the image of the friendly, charismatic DJ Freeze with the horrific details of the crime at Riverbend Lane. There was a collective intake of breath as the town realized that the predator hadn't been a stranger from a distant city, but a man who had been a constant presence in their lives. The disbelief was palpable in every coffee shop and office building. Neighbors who had waved to him and clients who had praised his work were forced to confront a terrifying truth. The mask of normalcy can be so perfect that it becomes indistinguishable from a good man. The pillar of the community hadn't just cracked, it had disintegrated, leaving a void filled with anger and a deep, unsettling realization of their own vulnerability. In the days following the arrest, a new kind of horror began to spread through the living rooms of Pennsylvania. Families who had celebrated their most cherished milestones found themselves pulling old wedding albums and graduation videos from their shelves with trembling hands. They weren't looking for memories. They were looking for a monster. As they turned the pages, they found him standing in the background of their wedding photos, smiling behind his turntables in the videos of their daughter's prom, and posing for pictures with their families. It was a sickening realization that a predator had been a silent witness to their happiest moments. These images, once symbols of joy, were now haunted artifacts. Every smile from DJ Freeze in those photos felt like a taunt, a reminder that while they were celebrating life, he was successfully hiding the fact that he had brutally stolen one. The history of the town was being rewritten in real time, one haunted photograph at a time. The weight of the genetic evidence was so absolute that the facade Rowe had maintained for decades finally collapsed. Faced with the undeniable reality of his own biological signature, the man who had lived a lie for 24 years eventually chose to plead guilty. It was a final reckoning that spared the Mirack family the agony of a long trial, but it could never restore the years they had lost. The justice was real, but it was delayed by a generation, a reminder of the high cost of a secret kept in the light of day. This case proves that the truth has a way of outlasting the lie, provided there are people willing to hunt it down. If you're still not subscribing, drop a comment what's holding you back from joining our tribe. Staying informed is the first step in ensuring that the shadows in our own communities are eventually brought into the light. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was heavy with the silence of 24 years of waiting. For the first time, the community didn't see the vibrant, energetic persona of a local entertainer. They saw Raymond Rowe for exactly what he was, a man in a plain jumpsuit, stripped of his lights, his music, and his mask. The transition was jarring. The charismatic DJ who had commanded the attention of thousands now sat slumped, a small and unremarkable figure facing the full, cold weight of the law. The room was packed with the people of Lancaster, many of whom had once cheered for him, now watching in a state of grim realization. This was the final stage of the digital exorcism. The ghost that had haunted the suburbs and the pillar who had performed at their weddings had both vanished, leaving behind only a defendant who could no longer hide behind a stage name or a spinning record. This was the moment where the truth was finally allowed to breathe in the light. The legal proceedings were no longer about complex genetic sequences or distant cousins. They were about the brutal reality of what happened in a townhouse on Riverbend Lane. As the details of the crime were read into the record, the courtroom felt the true gravity of the loss. The man in the cell was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a debt to be paid. The eyes of the investigators, some of whom had grown gray waiting for this day, never left him. They were witnessing the ultimate failure of a lie, The performance was over, the music had stopped, and the only thing remaining was the cold, hard certainty of a biological signature that had finally brought a predator to his knees in the sight of the world. When Vince Mirack stood to address the court, the room seemed to shrink around his voice. He wasn't just speaking as a grieving relative. He was the messenger for a sister who had been silenced in the prime of her life. He spoke directly to the man who had spent 24 years pretending he was a part of the community he had betrayed. The emotional weight of his words was a physical presence, a raw and powerful testament to the decades of what-ifs and the hollow ache that had defined the Mirack family since 1994. He described the stolen holidays, the empty chairs, and the agonizing frustration of watching a killer live a full public life while Christy's memory was relegated to a cold case file. It was a confrontation that had been delayed for a generation, and every word was a strike against the wall of silence Roe had built. Vince's statement was a reminder that the victims of such violence are never just individuals. They are entire networks of people whose lives are permanently altered. He didn't just talk about the death. He talked about the life that should have been the students Christy would have taught, the family she might have started, and the laughter that was stolen from their home. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted completely. The man in the jumpsuit was forced to listen to the true cost of his cowardice. The voice of a brother, steady and filled with a quiet, righteous fire, filled the space where the DJ's music used to be. It was the sound of a family finally reclaiming their story from the shadow of a monster, ensuring that the final word in this tragedy belonged to those who loved her, not the man who killed her. The sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole was the final period at the end of a long, dark chapter. It sent a clear message that resonated far beyond the walls of the Lancaster County courthouse. Time is not a shield. Raymond Roe had gambled on the idea that if he could just stay quiet long enough, the world would forget, the evidence would fade, and the law would move on. He was wrong. The lesson of the noose that tightened around his family tree is that the biological record is a permanent, tireless witness. It doesn't age, it doesn't lose its memory, and it doesn't care how many years have passed. The science of the future had reached back into the past to correct a mistake, proving that the anonymity of a predator is a temporary illusion that can be shattered by a single discarded water bottle. The legal outcome provided a sense of equilibrium that had been missing for over 2 decades. The man who had thrived in the spotlight was now relegated to the permanent shadows of a prison cell, a place where his name would eventually be forgotten while the name of his victim endured. The case stands as a landmark in the evolution of justice, a warning to those who believe they have escaped the consequences of their actions. The technological revolution has ensured that the perfect crime no longer exists, as long as there is a fragment of the self left behind. The closure wasn't just for the Miracks. It was for a community that had been looking over its shoulder for 24 years. The lesson was simple and haunting. You can run from the truth for a lifetime, but you can never outrun your own blood. As the cell door finally closed on the man once known as DJ Freeze, the focus of the story returned to where it always belonged, the legacy of Christy Mirack. She was more than a cold case or a headline. She was a daughter, a sister, and a teacher who believed in the potential of every child who walked into her classroom. The tragedy of her death is tempered by the memory of the light she brought into the world during her 25 years. While her killer is now just a number in a system, Christy remains a symbol of resilience and the enduring power of the truth. Her legacy lives on in the students she inspired, and the family that never stopped fighting for her. She is the reason the detectives never gave up, the reason the science was pushed to its limits, and the reason a town finally learned how to feel safe again. The final payoff of this long, wintry journey is the realization that the light eventually finds its way into even the darkest corners. The ghost is gone, replaced by the reality of justice served. Reflecting on Christy's life, we are reminded that a person's impact isn't measured by how it ended, but by the love and dedication they left behind. The townhouse on Riverbend Lane is just a building, and the archives in the basement are just paper. But the memory of a dedicated teacher is something that no amount of violence can erase. The truth is finally in the light, and the silence that once felt like a burden is now the quiet peace of a mystery solved. Christy Mirack's story is no longer a cautionary tale of a phantom in the night. It is a testament to the fact that even after 24 years of snow, The spring eventually arrives for those who refuse to forget.